Good evening and welcome to the Anne Devroy Memorial Forum. I'm Jan Larson and I have the privilege of teaching journalism in the Department of Communication and Journalism, as well as serving at its chair. I'm noticing that our forum is still populating, so I'm going to wait just a few minutes to get to the heart of our program. But as we begin our evening, I do want to remember that the Council Oak stands as the symbol of UW-Eau Claire's commitment to serving as a place of meeting and exchange. The symbolism originated from the first Council Oak, a majestic tree that stood where the Ojibwa and Dakota nations, as well as other nations, including the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Potawatomi, met to share knowledge and discuss peaceful resolutions to their differences. The Council Oak remains a sacred place and is recognized by UW-Eau Claire as a symbol of the ancestral and sacred lands of Indigenous people, past and present. We recognize that the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire occupies the sacred and ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples. So we'll take just a moment to honor the land of the Ojibwa and Dakota nations. Thank you. And again, welcome to the Anne Devroy Memorial Forum. This is our 24th year of naming a fellow, and because we lost last year in the COVID pandemic, it's our 23rd, it's actually our 23rd forum. This evening, we're going to award the 2021 Devroy Fellowship, and we're going to enjoy insights of Philip Rucker, who has served as the Washington Post White House bureau chief and is now its senior Washington correspondent. Tonight, he's going to focus his remarks on reporting lessons learned covering the Trump administration. As someone who has covered Congress, the Obama White House, and both the 2012 and 2016 presidential campaigns, he's well positioned to share the principles and practices of journalism. Following his remarks, Mr. Rucker will answer your questions. The chat function is disabled, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And you're going to be able to submit questions at any time during the presentation. The questions will be curated and posed on your behalf following his remarks. As we begin our evening, let's remember what doesn't change about journalism. Journalism at its core, at its heart, is about democracy. It's about telling stories that matter. It's about shining a light in dark places. It's about giving people the information needed to make decisions about our lives and the society in which we live. The journalist whose memory we honor tonight, Washington Post White House reporter Anne Devroy, exemplified the heart of journalism. In response to her contributions, the Washington Post and others created a fellowship that for nearly 25 years has provided a unique opportunity to a UW-Eau Claire journalism student. Before we introduce our 2021 Devroy Fellow, I'd like to acknowledge some of the people who have made the forum possible. I'd like to take a moment to thank Anne's widower, Mark Matthews, for his continued support of the Devroy Fellowship and Forum. Dave Gordon, Emeriti Department Chair and Professor, who helped create the initial forum. Camara Way with the University Foundation. Chris Knutson, Acting Chair and Associate Professor. Fellow journalist and colleague Mike Dorsher. Mike Gerke, our LTS Video Services expert, who's going to keep us up and running tonight. Our CGAO Student Group President, Morgan Meyer, and our CGAO Media Interns, Courtney Clays, Vicki Tan, and Victoria Boggs. All of these formed our team that brought this event to you tonight. On behalf of the Department of Communication and Journalism and myself, I'd also like to acknowledge former Devroy Fellow Brianne Shasa. Brianne was a force during her time as a student on campus and went on to work for several news outlets, including WPR and NPR, before her death from cancer earlier this year. Brianne's former classmates and journalism colleagues initiated a memorial fund in support of the Devroy Fellow internship that will assist in funding the costs of the program's summer internships. We mourn Bree's young passing, and we thank all of you who have contributed to her ardent support of the Anne Devroy Fellowship through this effort. Before Mr. Rucker takes the virtual stage, we're going to hear briefly from our current Devroy Fellow, Madeline Furstenberg, who will then introduce our new fellow. Madeline is in her senior year and served as editor of The Spectator, our award-winning campus news outlet, for 2 semesters. Recently, she and 2 reporting colleagues won a first-place award from the Wisconsin Newspaper Association for their investigative work about a campus administrator. Because of COVID, her fellowship has been altered a bit. She has taken it in stride, and we appreciate her patience. She's going to intern this summer with the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism and follow that experience with her 3-week fellowship at the Post. Madeline, welcome, and thank you for being here tonight.
Hello, thank you, Jan. My name is Madeline Furstenberg, and I am the 2020 recipient of the Anne Devroy Fellowship. In the year since I received this recognition, the world has changed in countless ways. We faced a pandemic that has claimed thousands of lives. We've witnessed violence at our nation's capital. We've seen a revolution for racial justice unfold across the country. And throughout it all, journalists have been on the front lines. If she were still with us today, I have no doubt that Anne Devroy would be front and center, asking the tough questions and facing down a society that does not always trust or value the work of journalists. She was tough and steadfast, and she exemplified everything a journalist should be. I hope to follow in her example throughout my career. I've already been lucky enough to lead a newsroom through The Spectator, intern with WQOW, and cover the nonprofit sector of Eau Claire with the Chippewa Valley Post. This summer, I look forward to interning with the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, which is an opportunity I may never have received without this fellowship. In the fall, I will have the extreme honor of interning at the Washington Post, where I hope to learn from some of the best journalists in the country about political or investigative reporting. The possibility of receiving the Devroy Fellowship is one of the things that initially drew me to UW-Eau Claire. While this past year has led to a lot of uncertainty, I still consider this fellowship to be one of the greatest honors of my life. And it brings me great pleasure to introduce the next Anne Devroy Fellow, Talia Van Sistine. Aside from being one of the kindest women I have ever had the pleasure of working with, Talia's skills as a reporter, her abilities as a leader, and her dedication to the field far exceed those of your average 21-year-old. She will accomplish great things in her life, and I look forward to watching her grow as a journalist through the opportunities that this fellowship will offer her. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie, for introducing me. As Maddie said, my name is Talia Van Sistine, and I am honored and grateful to be named the 2021 Anne Devroy Fellow. I want to thank every faculty member in the Communication and Journalism Department for encouraging me and helping me to constantly grow as a reporter and writer. I also want to thank my parents, Bob and Sheila Van Sistine, who are here virtually tonight, for always reading and listening to my stories and supporting my dreams as an aspiring journalist. And I am thankful to Anne Devroy and the high bar she set for future generations of reporters. From listening to others' accounts and memories of Devroy, as well as reading her articles, I am ever inspired by the way in which she held the most powerful office in the United States accountable. Devroy respected her sources, but never wavered when asking tough questions or hesitated from contacting a source multiple times. I constantly learn from Devroy's legacy when I report for The Spectator, Blue Gold Radio Sunday, and my journalism courses, because Devroy exemplified how the tenacious pursuit for information is crucial in journalism. No matter how many calls, emails, or interviews it takes, Devroy showed how such efforts are necessary to provide people with the facts they need and want to know. Devroy knew the battle for accountability and transparency was a constant one, but she fought it and fought it well throughout her entire reporting career, and I will work to do the same. Now, I would like to introduce our 2021 Anne Devroy Memorial Forum speaker. Philip Rucker is Senior Washington Correspondent at the Washington Post and previously served as White House Bureau Chief, where he led the Post coverage of the Trump administration. And tonight, we will get a glimpse of what such coverage was like as he shares lessons learned from reporting in the age of Trump. Please join me in welcoming Philip Rucker.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you, Talia, and thank you everybody else I'm sorry, that is my 8-month-old puppy barking, who was quiet and well behaved for so long until I started speaking, but hopefully he'll calm down here in a minute. But good evening, and to the fellow journalists and faculty members, members of the community who are joining us, and most especially to the students, thank you for inviting me to join you this evening. I want to thank Professors Jan Larson and Christine Knudsen and Michael Dorscher for all the hard work they put into putting this forum together, and indeed this whole day, because I had the privilege earlier today to visit with some of the student journalists and the staff at The Spectator, and I came away convinced that the future of our great profession is in very capable hands. I wish I could be in Eau Claire with you all and meet you in person. These past 13 months have been pretty awful, and there's just been so much death and uncertainty and isolation. And on the plus side, instead of having to get dressed up, we get to visit here on Zoom and check out each other's homes. And I'm beaming in from my study, which is where I've done most of my writing this past year. And again, forgive the puppy, but I'm just going to hold him here for a few minutes until he calms down. It's an honor for me to speak at the Anne Devroy Memorial Forum and to celebrate Anne's remarkable legacy. I never had the privilege to meet Anne when she succumbed to cancer far, far too early. I was in the 8th grade. I was training to be a competitive figure skater. I had no idea I wanted to be a journalist. And truthfully, I didn't even know what it meant to be a journalist at that time. I was so lost in my own little world. Weren't we all when we were 13-year-olds? But soon after I arrived at the Washington Post as a college intern some 16 years ago, I started hearing the name Anne Devroy. I learned about this tenacious bulldog of a reporter, this woman who ran circles around the men with her news scoops, this singular correspondent who instilled fear in the hearts of presidents. As I thought about what I might say tonight, I did a little reporting to educate myself more about Anne. I wanted to drill down a little deeper and understand what made her so exceptional. And here's what I found out. And by the way, these are attributes that are as essential for journalists today as they were for journalists in Anne's day. For Anne, reporting was about revealing information to the public and holding the powerful to account. It's that simple. Anne was incredibly persistent in that pursuit. She had the finest BS detector. She had zero tolerance for incompetence or malfeasance. She was indefatigable, chasing scoops early in the morning and late at night. No reporter cultivated or maintained trusted sources like Anne. She made it her mission to know everybody, to talk to everybody, and then to draw everybody into her confidences. And in her decade covering the White House, Anne counted as her regular sources, sorry about that, not only chiefs of staff and senior advisors, but junior political appointees and career civil servants and Secret Service agents, and the list goes on and on. Anne never stopped finding new ways to discover new information. I talked to Marilee Schwartz, who was Anne's close Washington Post colleague and for a number of years her editor. And Marilee recalled how Anne dissected the White House. Marilee said, quote, "She worked the playing field from the president to the managers to the players to the crew." Marilee described one frenzy. Hold on. Stop. I'm sorry, people. Marilee described one frenzied day during the second government shutdown, which had stretched from late 1995 into 1996. This was when Bill Clinton was president. It was late on a Saturday night, and the newspaper's deadline was fast approaching. And not expecting any news, Marilee was out to dinner with some friends when the waiter came to her table and said she had a call. This was back before cell phones, so you literally had to call the restaurant to get a hold of someone in a pinch. But on the other line was another editor telling Marilee, "You've got to get to the newsroom stat. Devroy has a scoop." So Marilee reached Anne. Anne told her she'd been working the phones from home and found out there might be a deal to reopen the government. Anne had the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, on hold on the other line. And on yet another line was Ken Duberstein, one of the top lobbyists in DC. So here's something about Anne. Everybody talked to Anne, and they even waited on hold for her to get back to them, even the Speaker of the House. And sure enough, Anne Devroy nailed her scoop. There was a deal, and the Post broke the story. I asked Dan Balls, who I know has addressed this forum many years back. He's the Post's longtime chief correspondent. He worked very closely with Anne. I said, "Dan, what made Anne so special?" And Dan said, "She was a reporter par excellence who literally put the scare into White Houses that she covered because she was so tough and relentless, and yet had such good humor about it. She was just a delightful person to work with." Shortly before her death, while Anne was in Texas receiving medical treatment, she got a note from President George H.W. Bush, whose presidency she had covered in its entirety. He wrote to her, quote, "I want you to win this battle. I want the same toughness that angered me and frustrated me to a fare thee well at times to see you through your fight. And then when you come back and write some story that I don't agree with, I'll moan and complain, but I'll understand with crystal clarity why so many of your friends, so many of your colleagues respect you, love you." The White House might seem like the most glamorous job in journalism. You go to work in a museum, literally. You ask questions of presidents in the Oval Office or the Rose Garden or beneath the golden chandeliers of the East Room. You fly on Air Force One. You get whisked through world capitals in armored motorcades. But it's a job, and it's a very difficult one at that. Anne never forgot what she was there for, and that was to inform the public, to expose secrets, to shine her bright light in the darkest of corners. Hundreds of reporters cover the White House, but very few of them ever fully reveal what happens when the cameras are off and when presidents make decisions. Anne did, day after day. She penetrated spin. In fact, she was so fierce, the spinsters would test their lines out on her. And I'm being serious here. We all know George Stephanopoulos. He's the famous news anchor on ABC. But before then, he was President Clinton's communications director. And as the story goes, George would call Anne in the morning to try out the White House talking points for the day. And if Anne said, "Oh, George, that's such shit," then he and his staff would go back to the drawing boards and have to rework those talking points. And forgive my language, but I've learned enough about Anne to know she had no qualms dropping a 4-letter word once in a while. And she surely wouldn't want us sugarcoating that truth, because after all, her pursuit as a journalist was to expose the raw edges, not sand them off. Anne once said, "Sometimes officials don't understand reporting is aggression. Civilized, proper, polite, but it's aggression." It is fitting that this is the quote from Anne that ended up in the Washington Post obituary upon her death, because it speaks to her philosophy about covering the White House. She wasn't there merely to observe history as it happened up close, although she did plenty of that. She wasn't there to mix and mingle with the powerful, although she did that too. Everything she did was in service to finding facts, to uncovering the truth. And if Anne had to get aggressive, if she had to yell at a senior government official, well, then she yelled. One day early in the Clinton presidency, Anne was at her desk in the newsroom on the phone with the White House press secretary at the time, Dee Myers. They were having a contentious, although professional conversation, and all of a sudden Anne raised her voice. She didn't quite yell, but she spoke really loudly, and everyone in about 20 or 30-foot radius in the newsroom could hear her. Dee must have just accused Anne of trying to intimidate her, because Anne said, and I quote, "Yes, Dee, I am trying to intimidate you." and I tell that story because it's important. You know, being a journalist can be lonely. We're not in the club, so to speak. We're present, but we're always on the outside. We're making those inside uncomfortable. We watch, we listen, we read, we explore, we interrogate, we draw connections, we detect patterns, and then we communicate what we've learned. Our work is adversarial, and that can be uncomfortable for us too. But this is the beauty of the role of the free press in America's democracy, and it is how we can make a difference for our fellow citizens. Far too many White House and political journalists, especially these days, get caught up in politics and personalities, in the campaign horse race and the parlor games of Washington. They lose sight of how the things the president and other politicians do affects people's lives. Anne never did. She, of course, was an astute analyst of politics and loved to gossip about who was up and who was down. But she also had a keen interest in policy, which is, of course, the actual work of government. She cared about what laws did, not just how they got passed. She wanted to see how policies translated in communities and shaped people's lives. To all the young journalists listening tonight, please keep this in mind. Politics ultimately is about the people and about the power of government to improve or impair their lives. And this brings me to today and the subject of my talk, lessons from reporting in the age of Trump. I wondered how Anne might have covered the Trump presidency had she still been on the beat. One thing I know for certain is she would have crushed it and beaten all of us, no doubt. But I thought if a factory could have manufactured the ideal journalist to cover the Trump White House with all its dramas and dysfunction and deception, the factory would have made Anne marry Devroy. I asked Dan Balls what Anne would have made of the last 4 years that America's been through. Dan said, quote, Anne had exceedingly high standards for how she thought White Houses and presidential administrations should operate. It was not out of any ideology. It was the ideology of competence. She expected competence, and she would have been appalled by the Trump White House, both for Trump's disregard for truth, but also for the chaos of that administration and the consequences to the country. She would have been doing everything she could have to expose it and to call it out. Marilee Schwartz, Anne's editor, agreed. She told me that Anne, quote, would have been beating up that White House like nobody's business. But Marilee made another important observation about Anne, and that has to do with gender. Quote, she was everything Trump doesn't like in a woman. He would have been scared of Anne. Anne was built kind of square. She dressed very sensibly. She didn't wear much makeup, and she was tough. She was very strong-willed, not Trump's kind of woman. Nothing stopped her. Anne was a woman, a mother to her beloved Sarah, working at the top of her profession at a time when very few other women were. Washington journalism in the 1970s and 80s and 90s was a white man's game. In fact, Washington anything in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s was a white man's game. But Anne was the quintessential reporter regardless of her gender, and she refused to allow the fact that she was female to hold her back. Marilee recalled that Anne carried herself with such strength and confidence as if to say, I'm the White House reporter for the Washington Post and I know what I'm doing. Nobody messed around with Anne because if they did, they got messed with. Think about that, because here again is another important lesson to our young journalists. Never allow yourselves to be intimidated. You must always be professional and respectful, of course, but stiffen your spines. If a mayor dodges your question, ask it again. If a congressman gives you a lame talking point answer that evades your question, ask a follow-up. Keep asking questions, make them uncomfortable. That's our obligation, that's our right, and eventually the truth will come out. My colleagues and I had to keep this in mind the past 4 years. There were 7 of us who covered the White House for the Washington Post, and we had a rotation so that every week one of us was on duty. If it was your duty week, that meant you attended briefings, you went to events at the White House, you traveled wherever the president traveled. You were the first line of defense, so to speak, for any news involving the president. Whenever my duty week came up, I knew chances were pretty good that I would have an encounter of some kind with the president. I was one of those reporters Trump knew personally. I had interviewed him several times during the 2016 campaign and then in the White House. He read my stories and watched some of my MSNBC appearances. My coverage of him was among the toughest, and he didn't like it one bit. I knew he didn't like it because he'd tweet about it sometimes. Anyhow, on my duty weeks, I would steel myself for the ugly encounters. I would try to keep in mind what our executive editor at the time, the great Marty Barron, said a few weeks into the Trump presidency. Quote, we're not at war with this administration, we're at work. That became a mantra for our White House reporting team. In April of last year, as the coronavirus was raging, I attended one of Trump's daily briefings. He had just theorized, based on an inconclusive briefing by a Department of Homeland Security scientist, that heat and humidity would make the virus less contagious. In other words, once summer arrived, you might somehow be cured by light and heat. Trump was giving people false hope, clearly. Mind you, this is the same briefing where he suggested people inject household disinfectants like bleach into their bodies to cure themselves of COVID-19. So I raised my hand and I asked him a question. I said, Mr. President, is it dangerous for you to make people think they will be safe by going outside in the heat, considering that so many people are dying in Florida? Trump said he hopes people enjoy the sun and he was just sharing, quote, a very nice rumor. Then he said he's not a doctor, but, quote, I am a person that has a good you-know-what, and he pointed to his brain when he said you-know-what. But the president didn't answer my question, so I tried again. I said, respectfully, sir, you are the president, and people tune into these briefings. They want to get information and guidance and want to know what to do. They are not looking for rumors. And before I could even get to the question, Trump cut me off. He said to me, quote, I'm the president and you're fake news. And you know what I'll say to you? I'll say very nicely, I know you well. I know the guy. I see what he writes. He's a total faker. In that moment, my heart started racing. The leader of the free world just called me a total faker on live television. What should I do? I used every muscle in my body to keep from defending myself, to not defend my honor, to not say to his face, I don't write fake news. That would be anyone's natural instinct, right? To punch back. But I remembered what Marty said, we're not at war, we're at work. My job was to ask questions to reveal a truth to the public. In this case, the exchange revealed several truths: Trump's ignorance of the science, his poor temperament, his bullying nature. Had I spoken back to him, I would have given him what he wanted, a fight with the media. The briefing would have developed into more of a circus. I would have become the story instead of reported the story, and I didn't want any of those things. So I stayed quiet and kept a straight face, and I understood in that instance that restraint is an essential tool for a journalist. There's another lesson I learned covering the White House, the Trump White House during the pandemic, and that is the power of narrative and the impact journalists can have by placing events in broader context. Throughout the year, I worked on a series with my colleagues Yasmin Abu Talib, Bob Costa, Josh Stassi, and Ashley Parker. Internally, we called the series TK Days because each installment investigates the administration's handling of the pandemic over a set period of time, TK Days. Those of you who are journalists know TK is the acronym we place in our copy as a placeholder indicating a number or a name or some other piece of information that is still forthcoming. Our TK Days stories were ambitious, usually around 3,000 to 4,000 words, sometimes longer, and based on dozens of interviews with top officials. They were hard-hitting accountability stories that laid bare the president's rejection of science and expertise, as well as the infighting and mismanagement inside his administration that plagued the government's response. We broke some news in them, but their main value, and the reason I am convinced they were consistently among the most read pieces on the Post website, was that they offered context and explanation. 2020 was a scary year for many Americans. Headlines whirred by. Every day came a new travesty, a new outrage, and Trump was omnipresent, saying and doing things every day, much of it shocking. Our readers, the public, were hungry to have these daily developments arrayed into a broader context, to help connect the dots and reveal patterns. People wanted to understand not just what was happening, but why and who was responsible. My colleagues and I didn't find all the answers, but we tried to provide some of them. And this was a reminder that even when you're covering a grueling daily news beat like the White House, there can be tremendous value in stepping back and assessing what had just happened, in digging deeper and re-reporting key moments to figure out the full story. It's not enough as a journalist to stay on the treadmill. If you're able to hit pause once in a while, then step off and look back. You'll be proud you did, and the public might be better informed for it. Now, I want to get to your questions because no doubt you have some good ones. And by the way, nothing is off limits here. But first, I want to tell you that the more I thought about how Ann Devroy might have covered President Trump, the more I realized she had, in a way. And that's because Ann's legacy lives on in Maggie Haberman, the tenacious and tireless truth seeker for the New York Times, who established herself as the leading chronicler of Trump, all while raising 3 beautiful children. Ann's legacy lives on in Ashley Parker, my aforementioned Washington Post colleague and also a working mom who addressed this forum a few years ago. Ashley is inquisitive and imaginative, as resolute in her reporting as she is penetrating in her prose. And Ann's legacy lives on in Yamiche Alcindor, the PBS NewsHour correspondent, who is simply fearless. Yamiche withstood ugly, sometimes racist attacks from the president, yet never lost her cool and persisted in holding him accountable. And after spending some time with UW-Eau Claire's journalism students today, I can say with confidence that Ann's legacy lives on in them too. And that, my friends, is good for America. Now to your questions.
All right, I'm going to call them up real quick, Phil. This is Jan. And let's see, our first question is from Mike McCurry. You probably know Mike. What would Ann make of changes in the press in the last few decades? The rise of social media, the drift towards more opinionated news coverage, the pressure on reporters to tweet and to appear on TV. Ann hated TV and never did it.
She, first of all, I'm glad you're here joining us, Mike. It's a really good question. I suspect Ann would be appalled by many of the changes in modern journalism.
I'm having trouble hearing.
Oh, sorry, that's my Siri. I heard from some of her colleagues who I talked to learn more about her, and that you're right, that she hated TV. She almost never did television news appearances. She would probably hate the idea that that print journalists like myself also appear as analysts on cable news, but that's the world we're in. I don't know that she would have been such a great Twitter, devotee and have adapted to social media the way so many journalists have now. But I think she would have been steadfast in trying to keep opinion and sort of personal tone and sarcasm out of her journalism. She seemed completely devoted to the objective search for facts and for truth, and she didn't let personal things or her personal beliefs color the way she wrote about presidents and White Houses. And I think it's one of the reasons why she was so widely respected, both by the George H.W. Bush administration, but also by the Bill Clinton administration, with the exception of probably John Sununu, the Bush chief of staff, who she ran out of town with her scoops. He ended up hating her, but yeah, I think she would have adapted. I think her reporting would have broken through, but I think she would not have liked the blending of all of these platforms and sort of the celebrity developments in journalism.
We have a question from Jackson Schmidtke. Do you think that Trump believed what he said, or did he have some sort of grand plan to obfuscate and deflect attention from other things going on?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the specific comment is that Jackson's referring to, but I think in general, we can't, as journalists or really as anybody, get inside Donald Trump's mind to really know what he believes or what his intent is. But I think there were some lies that he repeated so many times that he ended up believing them himself. And then I think there were other lies that he knew were not true, but he repeated them again and again and again for strategic purposes. One of them, I think, is that he claims he won the election and it was rigged. That's obviously not true. People told him it's not true. I think he chose to repeat that lie because he thought it worked to his political advantage. But he's not a moron. He understands numbers and he understands facts. And I think a lot of the exaggerations, the lies, the falsehoods that he made over the course of his presidency were intentional and deliberate. And he did so because he thought it would help him, because he thought if he repeated it enough time to his supporters, millions of people would believe him.
Thank you. We have another question from Crystalline Peterson. During your tenure as a White House reporter, did you have a moment of epiphany when you realized President Trump and his administration were distinctly unique compared to other White House administrations?
There was no epiphany moment. I mean, I think I recognized it the moment he got elected, that this was going to be a different kind of an administration. And then, when Trump was inaugurated, the day after the inauguration, Sean Spicer, his press secretary, came out for his first briefing and of course had the lie about the inauguration crowd sizes. And that was just one of those moments where you knew this was not normal and that this government would not work in any sort of normal, cohesive manner. And increasingly in those first few weeks of the presidency, it became very clear, not only was Donald Trump a different kind of president, but he would govern in a very different way, and that there would be a singularly unique amount of chaos and dysfunction inside the West Wing. I mean, that first month of the presidency was remarkable in terms of what happened. The national security advisor lied to the public, then was fired. The Russia investigation was growing. There was just so much happening in those immediate few weeks that was not normal.
Thank you. We have a former Devroy Fellow who's tuned in. Kelly McBride Moore is asking, what has been the biggest challenge of reporting during COVID?
That's a great question. I think, it depends on what kind of reporter you are. The biggest challenge for me as a White House and political reporter has been being at home and not being able to travel that much, not being able to interview sources in person, not being able to go to a lot of events. I think a huge detriment to our campaign coverage at the Post and in the media in general was the fact that so many fewer reporters were traveling. I did not leave my house the entire campaign. I mean, I left my house. I never left Washington, D.C. the entire campaign, with the exception of maybe like one presidential trip that I was on. But I would normally spend, half the year of the campaign year out in states like Wisconsin, attending events, talking to voters, understanding what's happening on the ground in communities, getting a real kind of visceral feel for how a campaign is playing out. And without that, I was stuck literally calling sources in states on the phone, having them tell me what they're feeling and experiencing. And of course, they're locked in their houses too. So I think the coverage was far less textured and complete as it should have been for a moment as consequential as a presidential campaign. But I think there were challenges for other types of reporting as well that have to do, maybe less with logistics and maybe, it was a huge challenge, obviously, for the healthcare reporters to try to chronicle this mysterious virus and to try to sift through theories and unproven conclusions to tell people the facts that we knew about COVID and what did we know masks did and didn't do, and what did these treatments that the president was talking about, how did they work? Were they safe? Were they not safe? I mean, those were tremendous challenges for a lot of reporters who cover healthcare and science and other topics.
Thank you. One of our CJ alums, advisory board members, Greg Leaf, writes in, how can we restore trust in journalism? It is vital to our democracy.
That's a great question. I agree, it's vital to our democracy. I talked with some of the journalism students earlier today about this very topic, and I unfortunately had to conclude I don't have an easy answer. I wish I could, and I wish it were as simple as a new president comes in and stops calling us fake news, and all of a sudden the public's faith in the media is restored. But that hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen. This is a systemic failure in our culture that so many people in this country don't trust the news. And I think the way we fix that as journalists is to do what we can individually, and that's to get it right. I mean, to just go above and beyond to make sure we're not making mistakes, to make sure when we're reporting stories, they're as bulletproof and accurate as they can possibly be, so that we prove to the public that we can get it right, to not let our personal views and biases influence or shade or color the way we're chronicling events in news organizations. I think we rebuild trust that way. I think the one benefit of these Trump years, even though he attacked the media so relentlessly, is that I think a lot of Americans have a better understanding now of the role of the media and of journalists and of the free press in our democracy. Like, people understand what it is that journalists do in terms of providing that accountability and oversight function in a democracy. And I think that's really valuable and good for the long term. I think it's why some of the bigger newspapers have had such a surge in subscriptions the last few years, is so many people feel like there's a value that journalism provides to society. But clearly our reputation is in the toilet, and we as an industry need to try to figure out creative ways to rebuild that trust.
So we have a question from an audience member, Carly Shimek. What inspired, motivated you to write your book, A Very Stable Genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America?
So I wrote this book with my Washington Post colleague, Carol Leonnig, and we were about a year and a half into the presidency when we realized we were both basically chronicling history, that these stories we were writing were not just your ordinary White House stories, but these were news events that would be remembered 20 or 30 years from now. And everything's flying by so fast. It's like a new headline every day and a new week, and by Friday you forget what the story was on Monday. And we just realized we need to hit the pause button and try to go back and try to reconstruct some of these really important moments by interviewing people who were in the room, by interviewing cabinet secretaries and senior White House officials who experienced all of this to get the full story of what happened, to really document what this president was like behind the scenes, what he was saying, what he was motivated by, who was influencing him, and why certain outcomes occurred. And so, we decided to take a break from the daily reporting to do that in-depth, backward-looking reporting. And we wrote the book. We wrote it really fast. we wanted to turn it around because it was a news book. We broke news in the book, but also it gets stale, right? The presidency keeps going, and so we needed to just move fast and write it. But we're really proud of that work, and we think it can be a contribution to people a generation from now who are trying to better understand what had happened in these extraordinary years.
D. Hall asks, have you ever seen an era like this in which truth was so much in dispute? And how do we as journalists reorient the public to facts and reality?
The answer is no. I will say I'm not terribly old, so maybe there was a time, but I can't think of a time in the modern history of this country where there has been so much misinformation and alternative facts, and so many millions of Americans believing things that are clearly fraudulent and believing conspiracies. And that all starts obviously at the top, and with what the president was saying and telling his supporters. Now, what do we journalists do to fix that, or to get people to trust the truth more? All we can do, I think, is just show them the truth and be more transparent in our reporting, to do things like fact checking the statements that are being made in public, to be very clear when we're writing stories about where we're getting the information from. Some of my colleagues at the Post do this on Twitter. They'll explain on Twitter how they found out the facts that formed the foundation of their story. I mean, that transparency helps a lot, letting people understand how you get to certain conclusions, and just being really careful about the facts and policing the information that we use in the media. I mean, we need to make sure that we're not spreading misinformation or falsehoods. And, ultimately, though, it's going to just require a real societal change, and the country's going to have to be ready for that. And I don't think we're there yet.
We have a question from one of our journalism majors, Evelyn Nelson. Looking back to your very first journalism stories at your college newspaper, presuming you wrote for your college newspaper, what types of emotions and personal drive did you feel when writing then compared to writing now?
I did write for my college newspaper. It's where I fell in love with journalism. I don't know that writing stories was like an emotional experience for me, but I did feel, I felt sort of a drive to figure things out. Like I'm a naturally very curious person. And I found when I was a college student that working for the campus paper gave me this license to find things out that other students didn't know, like to question the administration, to pressure the faculty, to get answers to things about the construction projects on campus, or what different academic departments were doing, or who was going to be hired to be the next dean. Things like that I found really interesting, and I loved, as a journalist, just being able to pursue that and to come up with the answers, and then to be the one to get to tell everybody what the answer is. And that's a very similar feeling that I have now as a reporter in Washington, and that I had when I covered the Trump White House. So I guess that emotion is the same, but it wasn't there were no other particular emotions that I recall having.
All right, we have a question from one of our very first Devroy Fellows. Chris Carr writes, what is the WAPO newsroom like these days? What has changed for how you work in recent months?
Well, you're looking at the WAPO newsroom for me. I sit here at this desk from home writing every day. Look, our newsroom has basically been closed since the beginning of March 2020. And we do our journalism by the phone, on the computer. We do all of our meetings on Zoom. I do my MSNBC hits from home using my cell phone. that's our newsroom. Unfortunately, I think the Post has announced that starting, I believe, July 1st, we're going to be letting journalists back into the newsroom, about 10% at first, and then by the fall, they'll be at full capacity. And obviously, once everyone is vaccinated, it becomes a safer thing to do. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I think, journalism, let me back up. I think there are some jobs and professions that you can do quite well from home by yourself in isolation. I do not think journalism is one of them. I think there's great value in being in a newsroom and collaborating with others and having sort of organic conversation during the day and sharing tips across the cubicle wall. I mean, that's how we work as journalists. If you look at the Washington Post website on any given day, you'll notice many, if not most of the stories have multiple bylines. They're not just written by one person, but a lot are written by 2 or 3 or 4 people. And that's because it's so collaborative. And when you're not physically together, it becomes very hard to collaborate. Not impossible, because we still do, but it just requires a little extra time and energy. And so I will be relieved to get back to normal.
We have another question from a former student, Jackson Schmidtke. What can journalists do to fix or demarcate the now blurred lines between news reporting and opinion, especially on TV?
That's a great question. The lines are blurred, and they're much more blurred than they were a decade ago. And who knows, they might be blurring further still. I think the answer to that question depends on what kind of a newsroom you're in, what news organization you work for, because in addition to the blurring of those lines, there's a preponderance now of news organizations where reporters take more activist positions, or they'll write stories from a political perspective, not a partisan perspective necessarily, but they'll have a point of view. And that's very different than the traditional objective journalism that I think most of us are taught in school and aspire to practice. At the Washington Post, we try to clearly differentiate stories by marking them. Certainly, if they're an opinion column, it's clearly labeled as opinion, and that comes out of the opinion staff of the paper and is edited by different people. But there are a lot of stories on the news side that are analysis pieces, that are sort of takes on some development, and the editors at the Post are pretty strict about labeling them as analysis and labeling them as takes, so that a reader can understand this is not just a straight news story, but you're getting a point of view here. But the blurring occurs, and I'm not sure there's much that can be done to stop it, other than for reporters to just be really open and transparent about where they're getting their information and about what their point of view is. And I am a believer that there's a difference between a point of view and an opinion. Or you can have a conclusion about something, or reach an analysis based on your reporting and based on your years of experience. That is not the same as having a partisan opinion. And so there's no easy fix to it, but I'm aware of the blurring, and so are our managers at the Post, and we are trying to stop it.
Thank you. So our campus colleague Kaya Simon writes, it would be great to hear your thoughts about both sidism and how the pressure to report both sides, even when one of those sides is inaccurate or outright lying, contributes to the spread of misinformation.
Great question. And somebody in one of the earlier conversations I had brought this up as well. And, I'm definitely not a believer in both sidesisms. I don't think, anybody on our team at the Washington Post supports that. Look, one thing that I think the Trump presidency has taught journalists is you can't weigh both sides equally. How can you say, these people say Biden won the election, these people say Trump won the election, and not draw any conclusion for your readers? Like, there are facts, there are numbers of votes. We know who won the election. And so the way we deal with that in a story is we quote the president, President Trump, saying the election was rigged, it was stolen, I'm the real winner. And then we immediately say, that is not true. He did not win. He did not win Georgia. He did not win Arizona. He did not win Pennsylvania. I mean, we correct the statement right away. We don't give airtime and column inches in the newspaper to a side that doesn't have the truth in its corner. And that's not a partisan position. It's just being on the side of truth, always truth and fact. So the same is true, I think, for some of our coverage of climate change. We don't do both sides when it comes to what the science show. Coronavirus, on and on and on. I think the days of sort of the right side says this, the left side says that, are pretty much over. There has to be real analysis that goes into to communicating to readers what the truth is.
We have one forum attender who writes or asks, what was your favorite and most memorable experience at the White House?
I think my favorite experiences were the foreign travel. I did not, growing up, I didn't do a lot of foreign travel. I'd only left the country once or twice. And when you're a White House correspondent, you get to travel with the president. And so I was fortunate enough to go on his first foreign trip, which went to Saudi Arabia and Israel and Rome, where he went to the Vatican and met with the Pope. And that was a really incredible experience for me. I'd never been to some of those places. I got to ride in a military helicopter over the old city of Jerusalem and then take the helicopter all the way to Tel Aviv, which was just like an incredible tourist experience. I know it's a job, I know I'm working, but I, as a normal citizen would not have had those opportunities. And so that's something that I will remember fondly from covering the White House.
We have a question. It begins, certainly COVID changed the way journalism is being done this last year. We only need to look at the press briefing room to see one kind of change. But do you think COVID has created any permanent changes to the practices of journalism that will last for years to come?
I don't know. I can't think, and maybe I'm being a little dense here, but I can't think of any specific change from COVID that would affect journalism long term. The only things that would come to mind, I think, are just the changes that are going to affect all of our workplaces, right? Like the ability to be able to work from home a few days a week because we figured out through Zoom and other communications mechanisms that there's a way to deal with it, and you can work from home and still be fully engaged in meetings with your work. So I think that'll continue for journalism too. But I really don't know that there's any sort of long-term change to reporting. I assume reporting will go back to the way it was before COVID, which is a lot of in-person, attending of events, showing up places, knocking on people's doors, getting coffees and meetings with sources to get to know them. I think that'll all continue.
How do you contend with the distrust of journalism from some of the public during Trump's presidency? As in if you were critical of the president and it was automatically attacked as bias, how did you contend with those attacks of bias? I think is what they were asking.
Yeah. I got a lot of those attacks. And, there's no easy way to contend with it. I mostly try to shut it out. I got and still receive a lot of nasty email, nasty Twitter mentions, weird calls on my phone. I just kind of tune it out. I don't respond to the hate. I sort of recognize that if we're reporters covering the president of the United States, especially at a national news organization, then that's part of the job, is to be exposed to some of that criticism. We're public figures to some degree, and it just goes with the territory. I will say that the Washington Post has gone above and beyond in terms of security for reporters. We have a really good team that helps monitor some of that hate mail, that can provide physical security whenever we have a threat. cameras outside people's houses, that sort of stuff. And I feel lucky and fortunate to work for a news organization that invests that kind of resources in making sure we can keep doing our jobs safely. It should not be a part of this job. I didn't sign up to cover a war, but unfortunately, the last 4 years have been tough, and there's been a lot of ugliness out there.
Forum guest John and Pam Roffler ask, did you ever go home at night and just shake your head over what you heard that day from President Trump or someone in his administration?
Short answer, almost every night. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a human being just like we all are, and you know, I never lose sight of the absurdity of some of it. And honestly, you couldn't cover this and not find moments where you just have to kind of laugh or or realize this is what it's become. But you know, I took it all seriously, and you know, as crazy as the things he said, they were newsworthy and important because he is the president of the United States, and everything he's communicating matters for this country. It's projected out to the world. It has real policy consequences that affects people's lives. And so, you know, there was a school of thought, especially early on in the Trump presidency, that, you know, we shouldn't be covering his tweets, or we shouldn't cover some of the loony things he says. And I really disagree with that. I felt like those are presidential statements. This is how he chooses to communicate with the public and with the world. And we as journalists should take it all seriously, and, you know, and hold him accountable, obviously, to his own words, but take it seriously.
Student Bailey Rieger-Brewer writes, how do we encourage diverse and intersectional voices to take part in journalism? And how do those diverse voices set themselves apart within the newsroom?
This is a huge dilemma for journalism, actually. You know, I think news organizations, including the Post, have made great strides the last few years in diversifying our staffs. And what I mean by that is hiring a lot of diverse young people into jobs, but those jobs by definition are at the more entry level, or they're reporter jobs. There's clearly not enough diversity in senior management at the Post, or you know, really any news organization. And I think everyone's mindful of that and trying to make adjustments and get up to speed quickly on that. But it's going to take some time. It may even take a generation for a lot of diverse journalists to get into the field, to feel supported in journalism, to feel like they have career growth potential, and then to grow in their careers. And the reason it's so important is we can't cover a country as diverse as the United States by a bunch of white men. That doesn't work. This is a country that's really rich in diversity, not only in terms of race, but in terms of religion, in terms of geographic location and background, in terms of interests and cultural interests. And, you know, journalism has for a long time been, especially in Washington, been made up of white men from the East Coast. And so that's got to start changing, and it is starting to change.
We have another question here. I'm sorry, I lost a thread here for a moment. I've got to get back here. In what ways do you believe journalism has changed because of the Trump era, and how do journalists adapt to that change?
I don't know. So that's a kind of broad question that's a little difficult to answer. You know, it's changed in a lot of ways. It's changed. The news cycle's been sped up because of the Trump years, for sure. The need as journalists to perform, and forgive me, my dog is now on like a barking frenzy upstairs. So he's 8 months old and he's a little puppy and he just requires a lot of attention. So I apologize. Anyhow, you know, I think the accountability function of journalism has changed. It's always been there, but I think a lot of journalists before Trump saw themselves more as stenographers or observers of events. You know, go cover what a politician says and write about what the politician says, without a lot of analysis, not even, I don't mean analysis, without a lot of scrutiny about those comments, or without digging deeper, or without doing additional reporting. And I think the Trump presidency has helped make every journalist understand the role we play in terms of accountability and providing some sort of level of oversight for the public, and made journalists dig deeper and not just report what somebody says, but ask tough questions about it and try to investigate and penetrate further.
What was it like for you being a White House reporter when Trump supporters stormed the Capitol?
First of all, I watched it all on television from home, so I wasn't at the Capitol or at the White House that day. I have to tell you, as surprised as I was that was happening, it was the exact thing that I had known for years could happen. And I don't mean storming the Capitol, but I mean a violent, a truly violent, dangerous, act of aggression by his supporters, because he had been stoking it for 5 years at his rallies. Like, I went to a lot of Make America Great Again rallies in 2015 and 2016. You could see that intensity. You knew how easy it would be for so many of his supporters to attack people, to try to hurt people, to maybe even try to kill people. And it was only a matter of time before something like that had happened. Sorry, there is really something going on with my dog.
That's all right. That's all right. Like I said, your dog can bark. The rest of us have to have quiet animals. How do you think journalism is going to evolve going forward? DJ Slater, a former student, writes, he says the challenges in today's world for journalists, shrinking newsrooms, public distrust, the damages of social media, etc., seem like overwhelming obstacles. Is there encouragement to be had in times like these for journalism?
I wish I knew how journalism is going to evolve. I just don't. There's so many different kinds of journalism now. We're not all one entity. We're a whole bunch of different companies with different missions, with different readerships, with different ideological agendas in journalism. I don't know. I mean, I think journalism will increasingly, though, have to be arbiters of truth and trying to deal with the fact that so many people in this country are believing misinformation, and how to confront that. That's going to be the biggest challenge for us going forward.
Right. I'm realizing that we're bumping up against our time limit here this evening, but we still have a few more questions that we'd like to try to get to, if that's all right, to keep going.
I'm happy to. I'm happy to, and hopefully my puppy will quiet down here.
So somebody is asking how your reporting for the Washington Post differed from the reporting you did with Carol Leonnig for A Very Stable Genius.
It's a good question. It's, the type of reporting is different for the book, and the way we present the reporting is different in the book, but ultimately it's the same thing. We're interviewing people and asking questions, but what we did with A Very Stable Genius, and by the way, Carol and I are working right now on a book about Trump's final year that's going to be a sequel to this. So we're in the process of doing the same type of reporting again. We did very long interviews with principals, with people who were in the room with the president making these decisions. They were interviews that would go for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours at a time. And we would ask people to reconstruct key moments, key conversations. What do you remember the president saying? What was that dialogue? They would review their notes in some cases, their diaries, their calendar entries, to try to get dates right, to try to get notes about dialogue right. But it was all about creating full scenes. When we're doing reporting for the paper, we're not constructing full scenes quite like that. We're getting information, of course, but it's much faster paced. It's a 10-minute, 15-minute interview with somebody to nail down key facts of what happened that day or the day before or the day before that, and rushing it into the paper. It's just sort of a different process, but it's the same skills and the same kind of reporting.
There's a follow-up question that someone asked related to that. where they write, it was reported by The Hill that you and Carol Anning-Haver will interview Donald Trump for the sequel to A Very Stable Genius. What do you plan to ask him?
Well, you know, we don't talk about the interviews that we're doing for the book just as a practice, and we wouldn't want to, you know, breach any confidences in disclosing that. But I will just say it's been publicly reported that we're interviewing him for the book, and I'll leave it at that.
All right. Someone writes here, I really have little trust in journalism these days, as so much is opinion and not factual reporting. Do you believe that the Post contributes to this? I'm not quite sure what they mean by this. Which one?
You know, I think it depends on what kind of journalism at the Post you're referring to. We have a great deal of opinion columns that run in the Post. We have a lot of analysis that some people will think of as opinion, but I think there's a difference and it is differentiated. But we also have a lot of real news reporting, and I do a lot of that reporting, and I don't think those are opinionated pieces at all. I think there's good, solid reporting.
There's two questions here that are quite similar in terms of dealing with bias. Let's see if I'm going to put them both in here if I can find them. One was speaking out against Fox News, that they don't believe that it's really news. The second question says, how can you balance and deal with the biases in some media outlets themselves, i.e. Fox News, etc.? So how would you, how does the media like the Washington Post, I'm trying to help clarify this question. How can you balance and deal with the biases that other media outlets themselves, and this person used the example of Fox News, how can you balance that with your work?
You know, I understand the question, but I don't think about my work that way. It's not my job to balance out a bias at Fox or at any other news organization. All we can do is make sure that the work that I'm doing and that the work that my colleagues are doing doesn't have that kind of a bias, but we don't see our work as somehow, you know, balancing out a bias elsewhere. It's just not the way we think about, you know, relationships in the media.
You mentioned earlier Trump's social media and the buzz surrounding it. Do you see politicians following in his footsteps and becoming more vocal on platforms such as Twitter, or do you expect them perhaps to take a step back?
You know, I think almost all politicians have become more vocal on Twitter and used it as a platform to break news, to make announcements, to inject their opinions and views into the news cycle. You know, they did that to some degree before Trump, but I think after Trump, it is seen more and more as a news vehicle now. The irony, of course, is that Trump is not on Twitter anymore. So he's making his voice heard on other platforms or through emailed statements. But yeah, I think most politicians are going to continue to do that on Twitter and social media.
Okay. Another attendee asks a similar question or a related question. In your view, was President Trump more a user of misinformation or disinformation?
I'm sorry, a user of misinformation?
Of misinformation or disinformation?
I may be exposing some ignorance here, but I'm not sure I know I can distinguish between misinformation and disinformation.
All right, we can.
But I would say he was a user of. He was a creator of misinformation and somebody who spread it widely.
How have the last 4 years under the Trump administration influenced and/or changed your reporting strategies?
I would say that my the Trump administration taught me the value in developing many more sources and finding other avenues to seek information, simply because you couldn't always trust the kind of front door people at the White House to tell you things truthfully. So, my colleagues and I had to rely a lot on sources who were not the press secretary or not the communications director or not the people who are like the normal sources you would go to every day for information. We had to find other sources and be more creative about how to find out what was really happening behind the scenes, because those people would lie to us a lot.
Thank you. How much influence does journalism have on the racial divide that the US faces today? And what do you say to those who believe journalism is the sole reason for this divide?
I'm not the arbiter of the racial divide and the role of journalism. I will say I disagree that journalism is the sole reason for the racial divide in this country, but I certainly can understand how journalism has influenced it, and I think there's a really honest and admirable effort underway in journalism at the Washington Post, but at a lot across the entire industry, to recognize that and to do our part to better reflect the rich diversity in this country in our own newsrooms. But I don't think we're the sole reason for the race problems in this country.
What's something that you wish, this is from, I think, one of our journalism students, what's something you wish you knew going into your journalism career?
I don't know. I wish I knew. That's a great question. I'd have to think on that. My advice, I think, to young journalists thinking about this career, though, is to just do journalism, like to not get so caught up on where you're getting hired, how big your paper is, how many viewers the TV net station you're going to work for is. Just get out there and do it, no matter where it is. If you're out there in the community practicing journalism, writing stories, asking questions, producing packages for air somewhere, then you're becoming a journalist. And people advance in this career based on the quality of their work. It's very easy when you're reviewing a job applicant in journalism to tell whether they're a good journalist or not, because you read their clips or you watch their reel of TV hits. And so the best way that you can develop a powerful, long-lasting career in this profession is to just get out there and do it well and improve and be committed to the craft. And ultimately, I think people who do can find their way. It's a very difficult profession to break into, and a difficult industry financially, has been for years. But good work and talent is usually rewarded in journalism, and I think people should have some trust in that.
This is a related question. How is covering political beats different from other kinds of beats, such as crime or sports?
Interesting question. I've never covered sports, but I did cover crime. My first job at the Washington Post was on the Metro staff, and I covered a community in suburban, really rural Maryland, Charles County. And I covered the school board, the county commissioners, the crimes, the fires, everything that happened in that county. And, that kind of reporting is very different than certainly very different than covering a White House, but also different than covering politics. If you're a community journalist, you're covering real people and their lives, and you're covering decisions that are made that affect somebody's neighborhood, or affects the school that their kid goes to, or affects what's happening down the street in their subdivision. And there's an intimacy there that you don't have in political reporting. And I think that's powerful. I think, learning how to be a community journalist and covering local news made me a better political reporter. There are a lot of political reporters now who start, straight out of college and go to work for, whatever publication, Politico or CQ or something, and they're up on Capitol Hill covering Congress, but they've never covered a school board, or they've never covered a house fire, or they've never covered the grieving family of someone who died at war. They just miss that kind of local human community connection that you have in local news. And I think it's a very different kind of reporting. So I hope that answers the question. I think sports actually is a lot like covering a political campaign, probably. It's a lot of travel, a lot of, games and who's up, who's down, interviewing the coaches and the players. So.
Thank you. An oft-cited reason, this is from another guest here, one of our former students, an oft-cited reason for distrusting modern journalism is the use of unnamed sources. What, if any, change did you observe in the use of unnamed sources during the Trump administration, and what role should they play in contemporary reporting?
Yeah, I think I agree that one of the trust problems in journalism is the reliance on unnamed sources. I will say we use unnamed sources probably more in like political White House reporting and national security reporting than anywhere else in journalism. And that's for a simple reason. It's because, people providing information to reporters in the government don't want to put their names on that information because they'll get fired or they'll face some sort of professional reprimand in the government. They don't want to get crosswise with the president or with the cabinet secretary or what have you. And so they say things to you as an administration official. I think one of the challenges that we have as journalists is that a lot of readers, when they read an administration official who requested anonymity, they think in their minds the reporter is making the person up. The source doesn't exist. The reporter is imagining this. That couldn't be further from the truth. And we're really careful about anonymous sources at the Washington Post. They're anonymous to our readers, but they're not anonymous to us. We as reporters know their names. We know their motives. We think about, are we letting this person speak anonymously in an unfair way? Are we letting them trash their rival unfairly, for example? No, we usually don't allow anonymous quotes when it's somebody making some sort of personal attack like that. We also have to share the identity of those sources with our editors, our direct editors, and they have to be comfortable with quoting them anonymously. And so, they are anonymous sources, but they're not anonymous to those involved in producing the story. And I think that's really important. And I wish, I don't have a solution for this, but I wish there was some way to communicate that clearly to readers so that they understand, these aren't just sources that we're making up, but that they're real people who just can't provide their names to the public.
Thank you. We have a former student named Trevor who's crediting one of his professors, Henry Lippold, for being a wonderful professor and saying that he worked for ABC, NBC, and CBS for 15 years, interviewed President George Bush. And he writes, the media has really done the damage to themselves with misleading reporting and blatant lying. How do you view a situation where the media should admit to their error or mistake and issue an apology or retraction?
I think, I think there are a lot of honest mistakes that are made in the media. I don't think there's a lot of blatant lying or misleading reporting. There certainly is some, and I don't speak for the media as a whole. Obviously, there are different organizations with different standards and different journalists who have different agendas. But, I think the way we deal with this and need to deal with it is being completely transparent when we make mistakes. If we make a mistake of factual consequence, we need to correct it immediately. We need to be direct in the way we word that correction to explain to readers what the mistake was, what the truth is, how the mistake was made, and just share as much of that as possible. Because I think, there's not much of a tolerance for mistakes, but I think some, if not many, readers will be able to forgive an honest mistake. And there are honest mistakes. Reporters are humans and they screw up sometimes. What they won't be able to forgive, of course, I think is blatant lying or intentionally misleading or putting adjectives in a story that have some sort of an agenda to take somebody down. That's not journalism, and that's not appropriate. But when we make honest mistakes, we need to correct them right away and be transparent in the corrections. And I think that goes a long way.
Was taking Trump off of Twitter a legitimate move to preserve democracy?
That's not my choice. Obviously, that's a decision that Twitter made as a company, and they have, it's a private company. It's not some sort. We don't have a public right to tweet. It's a company, and they can kick anybody off who they want. And they have a policy about spreading misinformation, and President Trump violated that policy multiple times. And so Twitter made a decision to ban him from their site. Facebook made the same decision, by the way. It's not my place to say whether I agree with that or not. I don't know what factors went into that debate. I don't work for Twitter or Facebook. I can't begin to imagine, why they decided to do what they did, but they're a company and they're entitled to do it. And, I do think it's legal just because of their standing as a private corporation.
Thank you. As someone who reported on and spent time with Donald Trump, what is the appeal for people who follow him to an almost cult-like degree? This is a question.
Yeah, there are a lot of appeals to Trump. I think at the core, and this was true in 2015 when he first started running for office, but I think it's still true today, is a lot of people see him as their champion, see him as their fighter. They had watched politics go on for years and years and years in Washington without feeling any connection to it, feeling like they're forgotten about, feeling like their interests are not at the center of the decision making in Washington. And they saw Trump as somebody who, said he would fight for them and remember them and stand up for them. And that's appealing to some people. I think, frankly, a lot of his supporters found him really entertaining and charismatic and felt like it was fun. It was a cool show to watch, and it was a cool, show to be a part of by going to those rallies. And they felt like he was saying out loud a lot of the things that they were feeling in terms of being politically incorrect, frankly, in terms of being racist sometimes. I think a lot of people were like-minded with him and felt a connection to him because he was acting out the way they wanted to act out. And then ultimately, I also think there are a lot of, Trump spent years and years and years creating a public persona of himself as a successful businessman. This, of course, was in conflict with the facts. He went through several bankruptcies. He was not a terribly successful businessman. He had a lot of money, but not as much money as he said he had. But nonetheless, he created a sense that this is a man who made it, who succeeded. He has his name on buildings. He has his name on a giant airplane. Everything's gold. That apartment is like a museum. It's crazy. That's intoxicating. People saw that as success, that he just breathed success. And they thought if he could turn everything around him gold, then surely he can turn the country gold and improve their lives and make them wealthier. And that was an appeal as well. And by the way, these aren't just my theories. This is based on interviewing hundreds of Trump voters over the years that I've covered him. And this is what a lot of voters have to say too.
Thank you. As a current journalism student, we talk a lot about reporting through observation along with interviews, people, sources. How important is being aware of and observing your surroundings when reporting in the White House?
I think frankly, a lot of covering a White House, covering a president is in fact observation. Like we watch a lot of moments. We watch the president on trips. We watch the president when he gives a State of the Union speech. We watch the president when he lays a wreath at Arlington Cemetery. Like there are just a lot of things that play out publicly, and we're there as reporters observing with our eyes and ears. There's a lot of reporting too, a lot of questioning and scrutiny and so forth, but a big part of being a good journalist is being observant, and being the most successful journalist is the person who can go to an event with 10 other journalists, but you're the one who sees something a little different, or who catches some movement or something in the body language or something going on in the corner that didn't look quite right, and makes note of it and starts to draw connections and detect patterns based on observation. And there's a tremendous power in that as a journalist. So I would say always have your eyes and ears open and be looking for anything that looks interesting or unusual or different to you.
what are your hopes for the field of journalism going forward?
What are my hopes? Well, I hope more Americans trust journalism, trust reporting. I hope journalism, frankly, can diversify in the right ways. I hope we find a business model that works successfully for local news. I think, some of the big national news organizations are finding that model in subscriptions, but it's not working at the local level yet. So I hope, I hope that there's a way that all communities have strong, robust, accountability-driven news organizations, because it's an essential part of our democracy and an essential part of the way municipal and state governments should run, in addition to federal government here in Washington.
So what is your advice to upcoming journalists trying to find their place in the scheme of things? How can they, and also how can they avoid burnout?
In terms of avoiding burnout, just pace yourselves. I had to think about this a lot over these Trump years, which were really exhausting. Just remember, the story's always going to be there tomorrow. So, you should not burn yourself out. These are hard jobs, and they're hard jobs for many, many, many years. And, you want to take care of your life. You want to take care of your body, your mind. You want to have a family if that interests you. Like, you should just keep in mind that reporting the story is not the be all end all. Yes, you need to throw yourself into it, but you're allowed to take days off too, and just pace yourself.
Okay. Someone is asking, what is your dog's name?
His name is, my dog's name is Axel, A-X-E-L, and I named him for the figure skating jump because I was a skater as a kid, and the Axel jump is the hardest jump, and so his name is Axel. And he's an 8-month-old Cavapoo, a little guy, so he has a loud bark, but he's a little guy.
Related to that, somebody asked, do you regret leaving figure skating?
I don't regret it, no, because I was definitely not going to the Olympics, but I did love it as a kid. I did it until I was 16 years old, and it was a passion of mine at that time. And I follow the sport a little bit now, although obviously I don't skate anymore.
All right. I'll ask one final question. And let's see, it says, how do we encourage diverse people to be comfortable talking to us? And I think related to that, just today, there was a story in the Post about a reporter who was covering the Daunte Wright shooting and was approached by somebody from the crowd, very angry with her presence, saying, you don't belong here, the media twists things. So I think this is, how do we combat that?
Yeah, I regret I missed that story, so I haven't read that. But I think it's hard. I think the best way to get people who are afraid to talk to us or have an internal hostility or may not feel comfortable talking to you because you're different than they are, I think the best way to approach that is to listen, to not be adversarial, to try to communicate in a very calm manner, and to be compassionate, to be empathetic. Having empathy is an extraordinary trait for journalists, and we need to be able to go into settings that are uncomfortable for us as well as the people we're trying to interview, and put them at ease and make them feel comfortable talking and opening their hearts. And it's hard to develop those skills covering politics, but you can do it covering all sorts of other stories. And before I covered politics, I was a local news reporter, but I also was a sort of a general assignment reporter on the national staff. So I would go to I went to Fort Hood for a week in the immediate aftermath of the massacre there in 2009, and did a lot of interviews with victims, families, and people who were in emotionally fraught positions. Same thing in Tucson, Arizona, after the Gabby Gifford shooting. And you just have to learn how to communicate with people. And the best way to do that, I have found, is to listen and to go in a very calm and measured way. Don't pepper them with a bunch of questions right off the bat, but just try to introduce yourself and say you want to understand what they're going through and you're here to listen, and try to get them talking.
Thank you so much. I'll apologize to those of you whose last questions we didn't quite get to, but before we close, Phil, I do want to ask, is there something that you've wanted to share with us today that you haven't had a chance to share yet? Some final thought you'd like to leave with us?
I think we've covered everything. We really have. I'm all out of thoughts, but I will just say it's a real honor and privilege to talk with you guys tonight. I really do wish I were up there in Wisconsin with you, because it's not the same to be doing it from home. And again, forgive me for the animal interruptions, but I guess we all are used to it now in the Zoom life we're in.
Right. We do want to thank all of you who were able to attend today. For those of you who believe in continuing the legacy of Anne Devroy, please consider donating to the Anne Devroy Memorial Fund, the Brianne Chasso Memorial Fund that supports the summer internship, and subscribe, consume good news. Be part of the ecosystem that supports democracy, that supports journalism, that supports our democracy. And I wish that you could hear us all cheering for you. You did an exceptional job tonight and all day long, meeting with our students and meeting with local and regional journalists. So thank you so much for being here. Good night, everyone, and we'll see you next year for our 25th anniversary. Take care.